Okay, so Richard Giragosian is an unusual fellow, I think, who's somehow created a presence in the realm of commenting and analyzing what's going on in the Caucasus, particularly in Armenia. He's the founding director of the Regional Studies Center here, an independent think tank in Yerevan. And he also serves as visiting professor at the College of Europe, the Nadolin campus, and senior expert at Yerevan State University's Center for European Studies. He's been commenting, writing, analyzing. I rely on him to figure out what's going on in this part of the world. He regularly contributes to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and all kinds of different publications. I won't go on and on, but you're going to be treated to hear from one of the most interesting and knowledgeable experts on the region, and he's going to speak to us today about the United States in the Caucasus. Richard.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. It is fitting, most of all, today is the 4th of July. And as an American Armenian who moved here about 17 years ago, it's fitting and also quite relevant that we're focused on U.S. policy in the South Caucasus. And specifically, I don't want to give a lecture. Perhaps I comment too often, but I want a more interactive discussion. So for that reason, I'd like to present a number of points outlining the narrative of U.S. engagement and U.S. strategy and policy. And specifically, I'd like to start with looking at the determinants and the definitions. What is U.S. policy in this region? Second, I'd like to focus on 5 distinct drivers of U.S. policy. And third, looking at the 3 constituent components of the South Caucasus. And in contrast to the North Caucasus, limiting it to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. To be fair, in alphabetical order. And the 4th area, the final area to frame a narrative, is looking at 4 elements of post-war U.S. strategy now. And literally what the Biden administration is looking for in the South Caucasus and from the South Caucasus. So let me begin by a blanket statement. U.S. national interest in this region is based on a traditional pursuit of stability and security, but I would argue American national interest is distinctly separate from vital interests. This region is rather remote, somewhat marginal from a broader U.S. strategic perspective. Nevertheless, there are 3 specific drivers or determinants of U.S. strategy. The first is development, and in particular, energy, and the development of the trade and transit and transport of energy. Beyond development, the second driver or determinant is deterrence. Traditionally, conflict management and mediation to prevent a renewal of hostilities in this region. And beyond development and deterrence is, of course, democracy. Interesting observation, however, especially as a Democrat, during the Bush administration, it was much more about democracy promotion. Currently, I would argue it's much more about democracy protection, and there's quite an important difference. In terms of these 3 determinants, the first being development. For this region, it's been about oil and gas, energy. And the milestone was actually in 1994 regarding the development and exploration and transport of Caspian Sea oil reserves. In what was a British Petroleum-led Western consortium, they signed what was then called the Contract of the Century. Now, this is very important because this focus on oil in particular, or energy in general, is not necessarily helpful to the other goals of deterrence and democratization. And a second milestone in development was, of course, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline. Interestingly, I was serving in the US government at that time, and as a Democrat, what the Clinton administration was facing was a difficult debate. The Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline in the initial planning stage was supposed to go through Armenia as the most cost-effective, shortest route. But at the end of the day, Armenia was, of course, excluded, largely due to concern over conflict, as well as the geopolitical bargaining behind the scenes of this Baku-Ceyhan. What was important, though, was from a U.S. perspective, this pipeline project was especially important to elevate Georgia as a key transit state and to embrace Turkey as another transit state. It was also about sidestepping the reliance on Russian infrastructure in pipeline politics, but also to bypass Iran. So against this backdrop of a focus on development, the second driver, if you will, is deterrence. For many years, US strategy was about dealing with frozen conflicts. Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, where the US position, in my opinion, was largely to keep them frozen. And there was no real optimism for any breakthrough. And of course, a different, rather unique third frozen conflict in this region was the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In this context, US strategy was driven by the milestones of a fragile but impressive ceasefire in May 1994. The reason I say impressive was it was a rare ceasefire that held for many years only based on the parties to the conflict themselves. There was little international monitoring and no international backing or guarantee. At the same time, in this deterrence strategy, it was simply to preempt and prevent a renewal of outright war. And it was as much conflict management as it was conflict mediation. The third area of US strategy in this region is, of course, democracy, and the promotion, and more recently, the protection or embrace of democratization. Interestingly, we've had a cast of characters in this region where originally Armenia was a darling of the United States, immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Armenia led the way in land privatization, stable currency and monetary policy, and a real optimism with the intellectual leadership of the first Armenian president, Yerevan-based. This, however, quickly dissipated. Armenia was no longer the island of democracy by the mid-90s. Georgia replaced Armenia as the darling of the United States, which continued well into recent years. Turning to the second aspect of US strategy is looking at 5 drivers of US strategy. In terms of US foreign policy, US public policy formulation, we all know well the limits of Washington. In terms of presidential terms, setting or limiting a longer-term implementation of strategy, as well as the first driver of US strategy in this region, constituent politics. I'm a former Senate staffer, and Capitol Hill, Congress, is where the constituent politics was a major driver good and bad, for U.S. policy in this region. And it was also about the inherent constructive balancing between Congress, which seeks to initiate more in foreign policy through the power of the purse, and the White House, the executive branch, which traditionally also wants to manage and implement foreign policy. So what we saw was the most important milestone of this constituent political drama driving U.S. strategy. It was in a piece of broad legislation regarding U.S. engagement in the former Soviet Union called the Freedom Support Act. I also worked on this legislation, but there was one particular part called Section 907, which was interesting in terms of a new, somewhat dangerous precedent, where this particular section of the act imposed strict restrictions or strict limits on U.S. official aid and assistance to Azerbaijan because of the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh, etc. This was an important indication of the power of constituent politics. The second driver of U.S. strategy is what I would say is defined as alliance politics and partnerships. It's exploiting the relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan, for example, the little brother and big brother, where from a U.S. strategic point of view, there was a desire for Azerbaijan to emulate and follow secular Turkey at that time, and as a way for Turkey to gain a larger regional role. The third element or driver of U.S. strategy is, of course, containment. It's George Kennan updated in terms of containment over Iran for the longest time, but also from the earliest point. More recently, it's about containing Russia, obviously. And the fourth driver of U.S. strategy was, of course, 9/11. September 11th, 2001 significantly changed the U.S. strategic perspective and lens, from the Pangizi Gorge in Georgia to the Georgian Train and Equip program to the Caspian Guard in Azerbaijan. And this post-9/11 security imperative was about U.S. engagement in this region over counterterrorism, countering radical Islam, and proliferation issues. And for the first time in U.S. policy, it represented a linkage between the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus. And a fifth driver of U.S. strategy is a little more positive. It's the positive game changer, at least in my opinion, of Armenia-Turkey in terms of almost 3 periods of engagement over so-called normalization between Armenia and Turkey. The first, of course, was football diplomacy back in 2007, 2008, and a second stage of normalization in 2021 under this Armenian government. And I would say more recently, earthquake diplomacy, where the border temporarily reopened twice. Normalization now is on hold. It's waiting as almost a precondition for the conclusion and signing of a bilateral peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So these are the 5 drivers of U.S. strategy. Turning quickly to the 3 constituent components of this region, an important aspect of Armenia that I don't think gets enough attention is when the Soviet Union imploded and collapsed, all of the former Soviet republics were ill-prepared, no experience with democracy, let alone in opposition, and the sudden and abrupt onset of independence caught everyone off guard, including those in Washington. What's interesting, however, is Armenia. Armenia started independence, day one, 2 steps behind everybody else. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova were ahead of Armenia because Armenia, at the onset of independence, was already burdened by the earthquake of 1988, and Armenia was already at war over Nagorno-Karabakh. These 2 impediments from the very beginning of independence distorted the economic development as well as distorting democratization in Armenia. From a realistic point of view, I'm sometimes surprised at how well we've done considering that starting point. Armenia is also, unfortunately, a country of 3 presidents. And each of them has left a lingering, sometimes toxic legacy in their wake. But I'll save that for questions and answers. Then, of course, another milestone was the so-called Velvet Revolution. Velvet, I never liked the term. It's a copyright infringement from the Czech experience. And revolution, no, not really. But it was a significant positive achievement in one key respect. It was a rare victory of nonviolent people power. And look, nonviolence usually does not work, to be quite honest. This was a very impressive victory despite everything else. And of course, the war of 2020. One important outcome from the war of 2020 for Armenia was that one thing changed. It's called everything. Everything changed. An unprecedented new geopolitical map where Armenia and Azerbaijan engaged in role reversal. Armenia became the loser. We thought we were the Israel of the Caucasus, when in reality we were the Palestinians in terms of asymmetry and power. And Azerbaijan graduated from years of justified humiliation and loss. And the final element defining Armenia in this context is Russia. And I would categorize Russian policy in Armenia based on a unique combination that I call 3G. 3G instruments of leverage: guns, gas, and goods. The guns from Russia, discounted weapons, are much less useful and much less the case, but it's gas. And Armenia's overdependence on Russian gas, that is a very effective instrument of leverage. Goods, I'm referring to the Putin prison of the Eurasian Economic Union, where Armenia sacrificed our association agreement with the EU. Turning quickly to Azerbaijan, the second constituent part of the region. I like literature, and what I like about Azerbaijan is its Shakespearean quality. It's father-to-son power with Lady Macbeth on the sidelines. It's very much Shakespearean. It's a 30-year dynasty of family genetic politics. Gaidar Aliyev came to power in 1993. His son Ilham has been in power since 2003. It's quite an impressive yet distressing condition. And what I'm worried about with Azerbaijan is the outlook for instability. The war of 2020 for Azerbaijan was dangerously incomplete. It did not win enough. This is why we see a combination of maximalist posturing and coercive diplomacy, meaning that for Azerbaijan, a peace treaty may not be enough. They need a conflict to distract the population from the lack of democracy and the corruption of the ruling family. And in Georgia, what we saw in the very beginning, especially given the first Bush administration's policy record, the embrace of Eduard Shevardnadze, as a reliable interlocutor as the former Soviet foreign minister, with Jim Baker, his American counterpart. Shevardnadze was not necessarily committed to democracy, but he was embraced in Washington as a known quantity and much more reliable than the alcoholic Boris Yeltsin. What we also saw, however, was the first revolution of fruits and flowers, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, where a young guy I met at Columbia University Law School named Mikhail Saakashvili emerged as the young, addicted to Red Bull, dynamic Democrat. But it also demonstrated an important lesson from Georgia. An individual Democrat like Saakashvili was very important, but it's not the individual Democrat that counts as much as the institutions of democracy. And that's an important lesson for Armenia, especially today. And of course, the Russian invasion of 2008 was a significant milestone, not just for Georgia, but also for Russia, for Ukraine, etc., as well as for Condoleezza Rice and Matt Bryza, having been around at that time. And in conclusion, let me turn to 4 elements of today's post-war U.S. strategy. The first element of current U.S. strategy in this region is very high visibility, very active engagement by the U.S. in Armenia in particular. It's a John Wayne movie, a lot of drums and dust of the horses, noisy, Nancy Pelosi, but it's really not sustainable, nor is it very substantive. I see the U.S. high visibility engagement, including facilitation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, welcome, but I define it as a pushback reacting to a vacuum. International relations is like physics and nature, which abhor vacuums. The U.S. engagement is more about Moscow and Kiev than it is about Yerevan and Baku. It's also pushing back Russia, if not pushing out Russia, and it's also to create a new environment. Think climate change, but in a different context. It's to create a new environment where after this high visibility, high optic American theater, when we, the Americans, pull back, it creates a new environment of European engagement that will be much less provocative to the Russians going forward. What we also see is post-war restoration of trade and transport. This is extremely important as the only way to regain deterrence for Armenia, but for the region, is to pursue economic interdependence and trade. This is the only way. It's not going to be a race to the bottom in terms of restoring a balance of power, nor a cycle of revenge or retribution. It's building economic interdependence. And the reason this is going to work is based on 2 observations. One is economics, for the first time in this region's modern history, are now accepted as genuine incentives to post-war stability, post-war peace, if you will. The second observation why it's going to work is because of Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. Russia not only remains distracted and overwhelmed, but this is the one area where there's an accidental convergence of interests post-Ukraine, where it is Russia that will be key in terms of giving them a role in managing trade and transport and becoming a stakeholder in a post-Ukraine South Caucasus. And I do think it's worth pursuing. And in conclusion, it's most important to say that there is no conclusion. Your visit here is a dynamic process of learning, and it's too premature to conclude anything. But I am optimistic. And part of the reason, because I may be crazy moving here from the United States, but I'm not an idiot. I would not stay if I wasn't justifiably optimistic. Armenia has the most promising outlook for stability and resilience. And we've overcome the most serious threats. From an Armenian perspective, we are nothing but a nation of survivors. And whether it's what I see as the potential and promise of normalization, Armenia-Turkey, which I support, as well as post-war return to normalcy, even by Azerbaijan, the outlook remains promising. In the United States, we have a concept too big to fail. For Armenia, we're too small to fail. Also meaning that it doesn't take much and it doesn't take many for genuine change that has been underway since 2018. So I suggest I hand it back to you and we take this into a more interesting question and answer, or feel free to comment or correct any of the points.
Thank you.